The two items were the plasmorum between East and West, which is a broader picture, and the other one is it's just my Bulgar chapter from my book. Now, as it turns out, the witty partitions article is a good background, but in fact, I am going to restrict myself to this one mega genre, okay, and which is has several names because it's very old. And I think when I wrote my book, I didn't quite understand completely this kind of chronology. So before we listen to some nice music, and hopefully we'll have some fun with this too. But understanding the background is crucial. Now, first fact is that I mentioned the word kasap, which has its reflex in Greek as hasapiko, which of course comes from the kasap word in Arabic and Turkish, meaning butcher. And there are a bunch of other names that are connected with this dance. Kasap, Kasapiko, Sirba, Bulgariaska, Bulgar, Hora. It gets really messy. Basically, we're talking about a relationship between four, I call it transnational, four ethnic groups. Four. Ashkenaz Jews, Moldavians and Moldavian Roma, Lautar, professional musicians, Greek musicians, Turkish musicians of two social classes, both Roma and then more upper class Turks later on. And this went on, this relationship is several hundred years old. And, but I must, from the outset, distinguish this topic from the topic in Greek folklore and popular music related to Hasapiko, which after the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923 had a big flourishing in Athens as part of Rembetiko, part of urban popular music and folklore, which is a very rich topic. I was part of a Rembetiko ensemble when I was a youth and so forth, but it has very little to do with this topic. And in general, the Ashkenazic Jews knew nothing about it. And in general, the country that became Greece is also not relevant so much to this topic. It has to do with Greeks, both in Constantinople and in other parts of the territory, including islands, and moving up into Moldova. And eventually, and this is the main point of this talk, will be the new combination of the Greeks musicians with the klezmer musicians in New York. And again, in this case, I'm acting both as a scholar and as an ethnic informant. And the sad truth is that the great musicologists, first in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union, they had very little access to this interaction among these four groups, not in Moldova, and certainly not in Istanbul, and least of all in New York. So you can read Kisselgov and Engel and Beregovsky up and down night and day, and you'll find almost nothing. In Kisselgov, at least you have a lot of material, you have a lot of notations. But Beregovsky never, as far as we know, he never interviewed the few musicians that he knew who might have known something about this. So since I personally am now acting as an ethnic and informant, I'm from a Bessarabian Jewish family, whose father was an avid dancer of klezmer dances and loved Greek music, by the way. And I grew up with also Sephardi Jews and with Greeks and Armenians. I spoke Turkish since a teenager. Now, this is a topic that musicians and the Greek community was aware of, but nobody could explain what it was. All they could say is a hasapiko is a hasapiko. You call it frelax, we call it hasapiko. It's the same thing. And that's the end of the discussion. And for years I wondered, what's that? How come? And there was almost nothing to read about this. And then as I became a scholar, I began to understand not only there was nothing to read about this, but there was actually a kind of conspiracy of silence coming from the academic institutions of several countries, starting with Moldova, Romania, Greece, Turkey, and their extensions into the United States. Not that they cared about the music, no, they cared about the history. And this was a very embarrassing history from everybody involved. And this situation begins to change only in the last 20 years or even less. So the basic historical facts we have to understand is that Moldova, not the republic thereof, the Principality of Moldova, became part of the Ottoman Empire in 1511. And Wallachia had already become part of the empire. And we have very simple dates, by the way. 3 days to remember: 1511, 1711, and 1812. Isn't that a miracle? Centuries, 1511, 1711, 1812. Now, 1511, the Moldavians finally gave up. The Moldavians finally gave up and submitted to Ottoman rule. They had a relatively good deal in that they were able to keep their native princes. So they weren't ruled directly from Istanbul. They had a native prince in Yash, just as the Wallachians had their native prince in Bucharest. Now, but part of the deal with the Turks was that apparently the grass was greener on the other side of the Danube. The Turks like to eat beef and sheep coming from the Danubian side, the north of the Danube, Wallachia, Moldova. And so part of the deal was that the Wallachians and Moldavians had to furnish cattle yearly to Istanbul at a reduced price. And there is a very good dissertation by Tony Greenwood done in the 80s about this process of delivering cattle, both sheep and cows, to Istanbul. And in my book, I translated a paragraph from Evliya Çelebi, the Turkish traveler, describing the entrance of the Romanian cowboys into Istanbul with thousands of head of cows. The topic of my little talk is the Kasap, basically, the butcher's dance, Kasapiko. Now, why? How come? And what I'm explaining is that the Moldavians and the Wallachians had to supply cattle to Istanbul beginning in the early 16th century, and this went on throughout the history of the empire. So there was a link formed between the Moldavians, Wallachians on the one hand, and then the butchers in Istanbul on the other. Now, in Evliya Çelebi's description of the entrance of the Romanian cowboys into Istanbul, he says they're great soldiers because they had to defend all their beef from bandits and whatnot on the roads. It's no small trip. So they were very militaristic. And then, of course, once they came to Istanbul, they would start making pastrami, right? Pastırma, they say in Turkish, but this is the origin of pastrami, or pastrama, as we say in Romanian. And eventually, in time, the butchers in Istanbul took over this task of making pastrami. And this was a guild. The guild was called Kasap, which is the Arabic Turkish word for butcher. Hasap is, and Hasapiko is just coming from the Turkish. There's no Greek equivalent for that. And in fact, as we learn, the guild was predominantly Muslim. It had a Yeniçeri, an Ottoman soldier, as the head of the guild, because the guild was connected with the Yeniçeri part of the army. There was a large Greek contingent and also even a Jewish contingent in the guild. Now, several things changed, and I'll give you my next date, 1711. 1711, 200 years after the initial incorporation of Moldova, Tsar Peter the Great planned to invade northern Bessarabia, northern Moldova, and he had the help of the Moldavian prince, Demetrius Cantemir, who was a household word for me since I've known about him forever, and I translated. He was a great musician. He lived most of his life in Istanbul, and I translated his book of Turkish musical theory. But he was a great musician and a very lousy politician. So he made the mistake of telling Tsar Peter that, sure, come into Moldova, our people will welcome you. Well, they didn't. So poor Cantemir had to flee for his life, and he ended up actually in Ukraine with an estate. And after this brilliant advice, Tsar Peter made him his advisor for Oriental affairs. How about that? So as a result, the Turks felt they could no longer trust the native princes. And so they removed the princes, both from Iași in Moldova and from Bucharest in Wallachia, and they put in Greek aristocrats from Istanbul. Now, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church lives in the Fener district of Istanbul. In the old days, I used to go to Sunday services, taking the boat over to the Fener to hear the beautiful cantor singing. And so the Greek aristocracy lived near the patriarch. And so they were called Fenariots, because they lived in the Fener. Now, for well over 100 years, these guys were ruling both Wallachia and Moldova. And of course, there was an increased Janissary presence in northern Bessarabia, northern Moldova, with many soldiers, and Bektashi dervishes coming with these soldiers. And so there was now a new demographic situation. As I mentioned, for many years, there was very little to read about this, because everybody was embarrassed. Nobody wanted to talk about it. So finally, my friend Christine Filiu, who had been teaching at Columbia, now is at Berkeley, she managed to break the ice. She's a Greek American, of course, studying history at Princeton, and she wrote a book here called Biography of an Empire, which is about one of the last Fanariots, so to speak, who ruled Moldova. And the point is that the guy was not even a Greek, he was a Bulgarian who had become a Greek in order to rule the Moldavians for the Turks. Right? So everybody would be pissed off, a guy like him. And he ended up writing an apologia for his life in Greek after he retired. And so Christine uses this to show how different the relations had been socially and demographically and ethnically. Many other Greek scholars actually have shown that this period was a golden age for the Greeks. It gave them great influence throughout Eastern Europe. And Wallachia, Moldova became a land of opportunity for Greek immigrants. And even today, in the Hungarian language, Görög, Greek, also means merchant, because there are so many Greek merchants even going off into Hungary at that point. Now, the Greek overlords in Moldova looked at the economy of the country and said, it's in bad shape. We got to do something. So they made it easy for Jews to emigrate, both Sephardi Jews from Istanbul and our Ashkenazim coming in from Ukraine and Galicia, right, which is our families at that time. They wanted skilled people like furriers and, bootmakers and so forth. And they also brought in musicians, klezmorim, came with the other Ashkenazim. There is some work in Poland, and also Yehoshua Ecker from Tel Aviv and New York has been working on this period. 1711 is a crucial point. We have maximum interaction then of Greeks of all sorts and Ashkenazi Jews of all sorts, including musicians. The next big date is 1812, when the Russians do succeed in annexing the eastern part of Moldova. 1812. And that's what we call Bessarabia, and is now the Republic of Moldova. So this created a very different situation. And finally, I mentioned 1826, the Ottomans decide to get rid of the Janissaries, who were not fighting very well. And that meant that the structure of the Butchers' Guild changed very much, because now you no longer had a Janissary on top. Many of the butchers were now drafted into the army, many of the Muslim butchers. And so the Greeks now had more important presence in the Butchers' Guild than they had before, but they still didn't dominate it. So the point we make is that this dance and music of the butchers was, again, a kind of transnational thing. Certainly wasn't exclusively Greek. And because of this connection with Moldova-Wallachia, it had a somewhat Romanian character as well. It wasn't that close to other Greek music or to Turkish music. And since the 18th century, the musical castes in Moldova were mixed between the Roma Lautar and the klezmer, the Yiddish-speaking klezmer. This is also a very important newish discovery. So the music of the guild was linked to what was happening in Moldova-Wallachia, and so it had this mixed Greek, klezmer, Moldavian, Turkish character from the get-go, and we can begin to document it by the early 19th century, so certainly. Now, to make life even more complicated for us, when the Russians annexed Bessarabia, a lot of Bulgarians from the Turkish side of the border crossed over to the Russian side now. And there's now even today, there's a large Bulgarian minority in southern Moldova. Evidently, they brought with them their kind of Pravo Horo, which intersected with the native Sirba dance, which was the foundation for the Kasap dance in Istanbul. And they called it Bulgariaska, in the Bulgarian style. And this we can document only from the 1830s. This begins. So one generation after the annexation of Bessarabia, the Bulgarians moved in. So, so now we have another variant of the dance called Bulgariaska. The Jews call it Bulgar or Bulgarish. Okay. Now, yes, so we have lots of names here. The Turks called the dance Kasap or Kasap Havasa, but they also called it Hora, which is a Romanian word for dance. The Romanians wouldn't call this dance a Hora, but the Turks do. The Greeks, and I learned this also from Stelio Berberis, who was maybe the last Greek band leader in Istanbul, that the Greeks in Istanbul tended to call it Sirba, he said, because of course it's a Romanian origin. So Sirba is the national dance of much of Romania. So it's called Sirba. And Greeks outside of Istanbul translate that as Servico, Serbian, Servico. But Berberis reminded me, but it's not Serbian, it's Romanian. It's from the dance Sirba. So, so that we have many names, right? We have this Kasap, Kasapico, Hora, Sirba, Servico, then after the 1830s, Bulgariaska, Bulgar. And then at the very end of this period, in the 1870s or so, after the Fanariats are moved out of Wallachia, Moldova, there's a new country called Romania. The aristocracy there want to create a national music. Before, they didn't want to hear the music of peasants and shepherds. The earlier manuscripts from Wallachia, Moldova had very little of the local dance music. And as we learn also from our late friend Speranza Radulescu, the Lautar music that we know developed very recently, after the independence of Romania in 1881. It's more recent. So before, what they had earlier was mostly vocal music, and it had several elements. The Greek element was very important, certainly. Western element was important, and I've written a couple of articles that I published in Bucharest where I try to show that the klezmer element was also important in the earlier urban music. But now we have a new style of urban music that has a peasant basis. And this new music was brought to Istanbul by Lautar and Klezmorum, coming in from into Istanbul, and it created a new form that was called longa. We don't know the origin of this term longa, but it's nightclub music. And back in the 1980s, when I was doing research in Istanbul, I asked one of my teachers who was playing at the Istanbul radio if he had notations from longa. So he went to the archives of the radio, came out with 24 notations, and he said, look, all the composers are Turkish, but the style comes from Iflak Bogdan. Iflak is Wallachia, and Bogdan is Moldova. That's how the Turks used to refer to that country before it was a country. So this is a known thing, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. So, very complicated story. And again, remember that all this story impacting on at least 4 different ethnic groups and languages, it had almost no scholarship dealing with it. But it was clear that once the emigration came, both of Ashkenazi Jews and Greeks into America, that the musicians understood this and they interacted. And again, I stress that we have documents showing that our klezmorim were going from Moldova to Istanbul. Since the later 18th century, at least, we have letters being sent from Istanbul back to Yash, to the klezmer synagogue, because they came with money, remittances, to their wives and to the wives of their gypsy partners. Right? So this Itzik Schwartz, the historian, collected these letters and published them. So, and then I have a wonderful quote before I go on, that I found a wonderful quotation from an English woman traveler in Istanbul in 1839, Julie Pardo, in her book, The Beauties of the Bosphorus, 1839. She's describing a public park in the Asian part of Istanbul, and she says, all ranks alike frequent the sweet and balmy spot. Wallachian and Jewish musicians are common. But these Oriental troubadours are not with their rivals in the admiration of the veiled beauties who surround them. You know, the audience were mostly veiled Muslim women, and Miss Pardo was sitting among Muslim women. There are conjurers, storytellers, and Bulgarian dancers to seduce away a portion of the audience. But the musicians, that's to say the Wallachians and the Jews, are the most popular of all, and a musician whose talent is known seldom fails to spend a very profitable day at the Asian sweet waters. God bless Miss Julie Pardo for noticing this. So what we see is that this connection of the Lautar with the klezmer, with the Greek and Turkish musicians in Istanbul goes up until the First World War, for a long time, for centuries. And then after the First World War falls apart. But precisely at that time, a new connection is established between the klezmorim and the Greek musicians in New York. Right? So as soon as the Greek musicians come to New York, they make connections with the klezmorim very quickly. And again, it's always a mystery to me. One of my first teachers, when I was 14, 15 years old, Nikita Chobanidis, a violinist from one of the Greek islands, from him, I first heard the name of Naftali Brandwein. He had played with Naftali. He didn't know his last name. Naftuli. No, he told me, great clarinetist. Years later, I understood what this was. So, and my teacher, my cymbalum teacher, Pavlo Limberis, used to play wonderful arrangements of Bulgars for a Greek audience. I wish I'd recorded him. He was the Greek cymbalum player for the New York area. He played a Hungarian concert instrument and beautiful arrangements of Bulgars and Frelos. So something was going on. And then, of course, when I knew Dave Taras, Dave Taras, okay, we understand, the klezmer name in America. When I was in my teens, I was playing percussion in a Greek band called Leventiko Pende, 1105. We performed one summer in the Acropolis Hotel in the Greek Catskills. Who knew? Near South Fallsburg. Right? Someone had told the local people in the hotel that the percussion player of the band is a Polish Jew, as they say, an Ashkenaz Jew. When I walked in, we all walked in to the dining room. I'll never forget, most of the Greek people, older people, men and women, stood up, pointed at me, and they shouted, Dave Taras! We love Dave Taras. We love Dave Taras. Wow. I was blown away. Then years later, when I got to know Dave Taras and study with him, I learned that his records were being produced by a Greek accordionist from Istanbul, he called Tetos Dimitriadis, Theodotos Dimitriadis. And Dimitriadis produced this record, Dave Taras Plays Again, on the Colonial label, some reissues on LP. And I was always mystified that on this record, there are several pieces with Yiddish titles which sound like some Greeks are playing, I don't know what. And also, Dimitriadis had reissued some of Taras's best known compositions under Greek labels, Greek names. My friends in Leventiko Pende gave me an LP of this, which I'm still looking for. No one mentions it. But it's Ternov Kosher as a Hasapiko, played by Dave Taras, but written in Greek. Who knew, right? So this was a major thing going on. And there is a new book called Greek Music in America, which has by Tina Bukovalas, is she editor. There's an article about Dimitriadis, nothing about his connection with Taras. Klezmer never appears in this whole book. There's no research, nothing. The only thing that is known, there is a very good scholar in art, I believe, George Kokonis, who has been researching another of the Greek clarinetists who came from his region, from Macedonia to New York. This is Kostas Gadinis, who did record some klezmer and klezmer-like things in the 1920s in New York. And Gadinis is interested in this whole phenomenon of this Romanian and klezmer influence repertoire in the Greek discography. And he has an article about this in English. And to make things more complicated, that region is part of the fur trade coming from Moldova to Castoria in North Macedonia to Istanbul. And so some of the Romanian and klezmer items were already known to these musicians. And I met George in 2019 in Bucharest, and we thought of doing some field work with his students in the region, but then the COVID broke out. So we couldn't actually do this. Who knows? Maybe someday somebody might remember something. So it's not only butchers. We also have furriers involved. And of course, my family, furriers, Moldavian furriers. So, and by the way, Christine Filiu, her family, furriers in Castoria. Right? So it comes first circle. But the furriers didn't have their own dance, whereas the butchers did. Important difference. Okay, so my first music example is by the very same Theodotos Dimitriadis. Now, he was a very famous guy. He was from Istanbul, born in 1897, so he's contemporary with Dave Taras, totally. He became very successful both as a musician and as a producer of music. He worked with several ethnic groups in America. He lived in New Jersey. And he would go back to Greece and he would record. But again, we know from Taras that he also worked with Taras, although we have nothing written about this. So he, in 1937, he was a virtuoso accordionist. In 1937, he recorded a chasapiko, what he called chasapiko, Zerviko, I believe, in 1937, and let's listen to this tune. Now, okay, right? A recognizable Greek chasapiko. Now, we look at this record here, we see a piece which is entitled Nocha Glezo. Nocha Glezo. another glass, meaning another glass of wine. Theodotis Dimitriadis is playing accordion with two other Greek musicians playing bouzouki and guitar. So let's give that a listen. That's Nocha Glezo.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
Right? Now, I wish I'd had the sense to ask Dave Taras what he thought about it. And, where did Tetos play this? Did he play it on the same stage with Taras? Or I don't know. And there's nobody around anymore to ask. But evidently, he has three items with Yiddish titles. It's Nocha Glezo, Lomer Tanza Freilachs. What does he have here? I mean, Nocha Glezo, yeah. So there's this was an attempt for him to sound Yiddish. Now, this brings up the very important theoretical point of what the Russian musicologists call intonatsia, which is usually called in Western musicology articulation. There are other terms. I refer to it a lot in my own writing. By the way, Stephen Blum, a very eminent ethnomusicologist from New York, also talks about articulation. And he's very much aware of this Russian background. In a way that many other American ethnomusicologists may not be as much. And Beregovsky, of course, was aware of this. He writes about it a little bit, that you sometimes have very similar melodies of different ethnic groups, but when they perform them for their own ethnic group, right, they want to be sure to change the articulation, change the intonatsia, which is to say, change the tempo, change the ornamentation, change the timbre of the instrument if it's a legato instrument, like a violin or the voice. Many things that will change, even if the notes are the same. And if that's not enough, change the notes. Drop something, add something. So, for example, in my article that I published 2 years ago in Bucharest, the klezmer tunes for the Christian Bride, which is also available on Klezmer Institute website, I show these early documents of Christian wedding table music from northern Moldova, documented in 1938, where the biggest genre is the Husid, coming from our Husidals, but they've been changed. We don't have recordings, so we don't know exactly how it sounded, but we know that the actual notes have been changed to fit into the intonatsia of Moldavian music. Now, Vasile Kiselica in Chisinau actually has recordings from the 1980s and 90s of how it was played then, after yet more generations of becoming more Moldavian. My article, I compare a couple of those tunes in the article. It's called Klezmer Tunes for the Christian Bride. And it was part of the larger repertoire called the Kuntek de Pahar, from Songs of the Cup, that actually Christina Crowther first alerted me to this many years ago. And when I was teaching at NYU in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, they gave me generous funding to research this in Moldova, in Romania, in Istanbul, and so forth. I did many interviews with people, also in Israel and in Canada. And a little bit goes into my article, The Klezmer Tunes for the Christian Bride, but there's a lot more stuff out there. And thanks to our colleague and friend, Kiselitsa, he has a gold mine of material about this. And he's convinced that it's centuries old. It's nothing new. It probably goes back to when the Ashkenazim first were coming to Moldova in the 18th century, which this is the most clear example of anywhere in Europe of Jews having a very important influence on the structure of the national music, a certain part of the national music. Now, after the Holocaust, of course, where there are very few Jews there, and very few in the small towns, they began to corrupt the name. The musicians now, or non-Jewish musicians, don't call it Husid anymore. They call it Husin, or even Husar, and nobody knows what is Husid. But back in 1938, when the first documentation was done, and by the way, the violinist was a Greek Orthodox priest named Kyriak. And he was a famous violinist in the region. No doubt he had worked with klezmorim in the region. And he knew the tunes were called Husid. It's the largest group of tunes in that repertoire was Husid. So another big story. So again, the intonatia, the articulation has to be different for the different national group. This is, again, a big topic that needs very precise documentation. But in the case of Dimitriades, here we have the same guy. It's not like another Greek is playing for the Jews. No, it's the same Greek. But he knows he has a different audience. So the first thing we hear is the tempo is slower, right? And several other things are somewhat different, although it's still recognized to be Greek. I should also add that this kind of tune is not in the Bulgar category. It's not transitional repertoire. And it finally dawned on me after many years, in the klezmer repertoire, we have a number of Kasap-like melodies, which they have no name anymore. They're old enough, so they're simply called freilachs or share, and that's it. And in my book, I give an example of a Kasapiko, which Beregovsky documents as a share in Ukraine. It's the same tune. It's the same tune. So it shows you the age, whereas the Bulgar is a bit younger. And Bulgar is a fusion of the Kasap with the Sirba. And so it has a different character. It was a new thing. It was what John Blacking would call flexible non-change. It's something old, but something new based on the old, so people liked it. It became very popular.
So Zev, I have a question for you that I think might be relevant and easily understood by all of us here, which is when Dimitriados plays Noch a Gläsel, but it still sounds like Greek music. We agree. It sounds rather Greek rather than Yiddish.
Right.
Could you understand this as a kind of an involuntary accent that he has? I mean, even the attempt to play Yiddish music is filtered through a certain accent, just like when we speak another language. And of course, this accent can also involve compensation, that you hear something and you exaggerate it, or you hear something and you underplay it. I mean, I'm thinking of when Naftuli plays a kolomeka, for example, and it doesn't sound like a Ukrainian kolomeka. It sounds like a klezmer musician playing a kolomeka, even if he thinks he's playing a kolomeka. He's not trying to play it like a Yiddish kolomeka. He's playing a kolomeka, but it still sounds, it's colored by a Yiddish musical accent. Do you agree with that?
Yes, in general, but the important difference is that Dimitriades was producing klezmer musicians, right? And there was a Greek market for real klezmer music. By the way, I should mention in Toronto, years ago, I interviewed a Jewish fellow who had a record store. And he mentioned to me that records like this from Dave Taras, he said in the last 20 years, this was 20 years ago, he said he kept them not so much for Jews, but for Greeks. Greeks are interested in this. Right? That's an important detail. Now, with Ukrainians and klezmorim, there's a big difference that, as Beregovsky also mentions, the Jews did not collaborate with the Ukrainian musicians class because there wasn't any. There wasn't any. If anything, and I learned this from my interviews, Ukrainians would study with klezmorim, not the other way around. So that there was no reason that Naftali would want to sound like a Ukrainian musician. On the contrary. Okay, whereas Dimitriadis respected klezmorim, his community respected klezmorim. He gives it a Yiddish title, which gives me the idea that perhaps he thought Jews would appreciate this. I don't know. But in general, I would think he's probably playing for Greeks. Just like my teacher, Limberis, definitely was playing his Bulgars for a Greek audience. So this, again, a little documented reality. Just like Kostas Gadinis. In 1927, he records this wonderful, Joel Rubin has in his first book, he has a notation comparison. Joel is there, hello. And I mentioned this in my klezmer Tunes for the Christian Bride article, that this tune, which is already in Belf, it's a wedding tune or a chosidal tune perhaps. Gadinis records it as Hasapiko Rumanico. And Rumanico is a code for Jewish. So there are questions about say, Gadinis' performance style, which is Macedonian. He was from North Macedonia. And again, Joe would know this better than I would, but it's very different than the styles of the rest of Greece. And Greek musicians always told me this, like Karakosta was the great clarinetist from Peloponnesus that was considered really Greek. Somehow, Gadinis was something else. They respected him, but there was something a bit foreign about him. But we may get to Gadinis. I have one example here from him. But let's go on. I don't want to ignore the Turks. Let's play a recent Turkish example of the Kasap Havası. It's the Istanbul Kasaba.
Okay, here we go.
Okay. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Now, this is from my friend Murat Tokac, who issued a recording in Istanbul about 10 years ago. He issued a recording called From Sirto'dan Longa'ya, from the Sirto to the Longa. And Sirto, again, is the Turkish misuse of the word Sirba, right? And then to the Longa, which is, as I mentioned, is the more nightclub style of this dancing. It's 2 volumes, all Turkish musicians. And again, some of the tunes are shared with the Greek community in Istanbul. But from the Turkish point of view, it's not Greek. It's folklore of Istanbul. You know, and 3 years ago, I gave a talk at the Istanbul Research Institute about the Kasap Havası, the Kasap. You know, and this is part of the Turkish folklore of Istanbul as well. And they're also great musicians, so it's really cooking. Okay, the last pair of examples I want to give you. Remember those ladies listening to the klezmorim and lautars in Istanbul 150 years ago or something, right? Now, in 1912, one of the few women musicians, women violinists in Istanbul, Kevser Hanım, who taught in the conservatory in Istanbul. In 1912, she issued a piece, she claims to have composed a piece called Nihavent Sirto, and it's become a staple of the nightclub music of Istanbul ever since then. Can we play a little bit? I don't have her playing, I wish I did. This is a modern ensemble playing Nihavent Sirto.
It's the same.
Nihavent Sirto, okay. Now, did you also play Solinsky's Rumänische Fantasie? Okay, again, this is recorded 1911. Now, of course, we can't compare intonation because one is a 1911 recording and the other is, a very recent recording. If only we could hear Kevser Hanım herself. But there are many interesting questions here. I remember playing this recording for Yermia Hescheles, who was the last klezmer band leader from Europe that we know. He passed away in 2010 at the age of 100. He was from the region of Lvov. And when he listened to Solinsky's playing in the recording, he said, well, it's not from here. It's not from Lvov area. It's probably from somewhere in the south, near Bukovina, like maybe Kolome or something. It was foreign to him. It was more oriental. He said, we didn't play this style in Lvov. Okay, but evidently other Jews further south did. Now, I know from Leon Schwartz that Jews from Bukovina, klezmorim from Bukovina, were still going to Istanbul in his lifetime, before the First World War. He knew one who'd gone to Istanbul and come back with a tune that he composed in what he thought of as a Turkish style. So I asked myself, how is it Kevser Hanım is writing this simplified version of Solinsky's tune? It's much more basic and reduced. Solinsky, the melody we have from Solinsky, again, I have this in my Klezmer to Christian Bride article. It appears in the Stoyanov collection in the 1960s. And then German Goldenstein knew it and played it in New York. He also came from northern Bessarabia. So this tune has a yichus, it has a lineage all the way from Galicia to Bukovina and Bessarabia among both Jews and Moldavians. Now, it's a strange bird in Istanbul, and I wonder, did they ever meet? Did Solinsky go to Istanbul with other Galician klezmorim? He could have. And then in the witty partition article, I thought of, did he meet her on a moonlit night? Did he meet Kevser Hanım on a moonlit night at the sweet waters of Asia? Did they meet in a nightclub somewhere? It's a question. Or then now I think of it with these veiled beauties, the Turkish ladies listening to the klezmorim in Istanbul 150 years ago. Maybe Kevser Hanım was the granddaughter of one of those ladies. And her grandmother said, listen, Kevser, if you hear this kind of troubadour, a Jewish guy coming from Moldova, pay attention to what he's playing.
Zev, I think this is the point where you're ready to become a novelist based upon your scholarship, and I'm ready to read that book.
Thank you.